For decades, the Titanic has been explained as a chain of failures and an iceberg in the ship's path. But what if the most decisive factor wasn't the damage at all, but the North Atlantic cold, water hovering around 28 degrees Fahrenheit? In this video, the reconstruction focuses on how ice-cold water wrecks coordination and cuts usable survival time down to just minutes. Like the video and subscribe to follow the full analysis. At that North Atlantic latitude in April, seawater can sit near 28 degrees because salt lowers the freezing point. Even with calm seas, the biggest threat is rapid heat loss. In water, the body cools far faster than in air. Calm conditions reduce waves and foam, which can weaken the visual contrast needed to spot ice at a distance. The cold also impacts work on deck, reducing hand dexterity and increasing the time it takes to complete tasks. This turns the environment into an operational variable, not just a weather detail. It's the physical context that limits survival to minutes. At night, the bridge depends on observation, instruments and watch routines to hold course and speed. With low light and a glassy sea, the horizon and low objects can lose definition. The command structure stays the same: monitor position, log information, and assign tasks by sector. Meanwhile, interior areas continue running normally with electric lighting and onboard services. That sense of normalcy can delay the realization of real risk. In extreme cold, the mistake doesn't have to be big to have big consequences. Radio messages about ice circulate as part of normal navigation traffic for the era. What changes outcomes isn't whether warnings exist, but how they're prioritized, recorded, and integrated into route and speed control. The bridge works with charts, plotted marks, and estimates, always with a margin of uncertainty. Visual lookout remains essential because ice can sit beyond any immediate confirmation. In calm seas, an iceberg can be detected late due to the lack of foam and contrast. Routine plus limited visibility creates an accumulated risk. The ship was built with watertight compartments and doors designed to limit flooding. In practice, it works within a limit. It depends on how many compartments are breached and how water advances. When sealing is compromised in multiple areas, the system stops being a barrier and becomes a delay mechanism. That's why technical teams take soundings, track seat points, and adjust pumps and valves. The operational goal is to buy time and keep access routes usable. The interior architecture is part of the problem and part of the attempted solution. Here, the iceberg contact isn't treated as a head-on collision, but as a long lateral scrape along the hull. That kind of damage can spread openings across a wide section, hitting more than one compartment. The result is progressive: vibration, structural noise, then the first signs of water in lower levels. Next come measurements and inspections to identify where inflow is greatest and whether containment is realistic. On a ship this large, minutes are spent just confirming the situation with precision. The initial event is fast. The consequences keep unfolding. As water comes in, the first visible change is trim. The bow begins to settle. That affects internal movement, the stability of objects, and the operation of doors and stairways. Technical teams measure levels, engage pumps, and set up barriers where slowing the advance is still possible. At the same time, the bridge watches external indicators like deck height relative to the sea. It's a physical process that becomes visible before it turns chaotic. From here on, evacuation stops being hypothetical and becomes logistics. Closing watertight doors and running pumps are attempts to contain and delay flooding. Even so, once multiple compartments are compromised, the tendency is for the water to win. It wins through the combined inflow points and the pressure difference. As the ship lists, internal movement becomes harder and response time increases. Low corridors turn damp, then slick, and the working margin shrinks. The structure behaves like a system. Small changes in one place show up as large effects elsewhere. In this phase, progression is the key to understanding why the available time is less than it looks. Lifeboats require the correct sequence. Remove covers, check fittings, organize lines, and keep the boat level during the lowering. The operation depends on coordination, deck conditions, and how the falls behave under tension. On a freezing night, materials stiffen and hand dexterity drops, adding time to knots, locks, and adjustments. On top of that, the ship's increasing angle changes the geometry of the davits and the stability of the system. Even with calm seas, it's still a technical maneuver. Every minute saved here has a direct effect out there. As the deck angle increases, the movement of people and supplies slows and becomes more vulnerable to bottlenecks. Handing out life vests, navigating corridors, and reaching the boat deck all compete for limited physical space. Launching boats requires balance and controlled motion because an unstable descent can compromise the boat and crew. With each boat that pulls away, the contrast sharpens between those insulated from the water and those still dependent on the ship. The scene may look organized, but physics is already setting the limits. The critical point starts shifting from the ship to the outside environment. What decides survival outside the ship comes down to a simple trio: temperature, time, and insulation from the water. In near-freezing water, cold shock can disrupt breathing and coordination almost immediately, and loss of dexterity reduces the ability to hold on or climb onto debris. Even in a lifeboat, cold wind and damp clothing keep the physiological risk active. If this analysis is landing for you, like the video and subscribe, because in the next blocks we move from what happened to why the cold decides so fast. From here on, the night isn't just dark, it's a physical limiter. With the bow dropping, the ship starts operating under a basic effect. The deck angle changes movement and reduces the efficiency of every procedure. In lower levels, water creates slick surfaces and makes doors and passages harder to use. The technical crew keeps measuring levels and trying to slow the progression, but the dominant variable is how many compartments were breached. In parallel, evacuation follows mechanical logic: cables, pulleys, boat balance, and execution time. Calm seas help the lowering. They don't reduce the external hazard. The gap between "there's still time" and "there isn't" keeps shrinking. As flooding advances, the energy cost of each task increases: walking, carrying, operating valves, keeping access routes possible. On a listing ship, even everyday objects become physical indicators of what's happening because they slide and block corridors. Lifeboat work continues to depend on stability and alignment, avoiding hull-to-boat contact. Inside, water and lighting reveal the same reality. Containment only buys time. It doesn't reverse the situation. What you observe is a gradual acceleration, not one single moment. At this stage, the decisive factor still isn't the seawater itself, but the remaining time before it becomes unavoidable for those not in a boat. As the angle increases, the physical sequence becomes more defined. The bow settles until water dominates the front of the ship, and the structure begins to carry loads beyond normal limits. When structural integrity fails, the hull enters a separation phase, consistent with a bow-first sinking progression followed by rupture. From this point on, the ship stops being an environment and becomes a rapidly changing mass. What was an evacuation problem becomes a survival in open water problem. Distance to a lifeboat and time to rescue become the central variables. The visual peak is the end of the ship as a platform. What follows is the math of cold. In near-freezing water, the first critical effect is cold shock. Breathing becomes uncontrolled and movements turn uncoordinated. Even with a cork life vest, keeping airways out of the water takes coordination that degrades fast. The body loses heat far faster in water than in air, reducing the ability to grip, climb onto debris, or swim in any useful way. Calm seas don't mean safety. They only reduce noise and foam while the water stays just as lethal. Limited light also matters. A boat can be relatively close and still never make effective contact. Here, the environment replaces the sinking as the dominant operational cause. Within minutes, loss of dexterity makes simple tasks nearly impossible. Holding rope, tying knots, pulling your own body up. Raw strength stops being the advantage because the main problem becomes motor control and breathing, not energy or willpower. In lifeboats, any approach has to consider stability and overload risk, shaping operational decisions. In the water, small gains in insulation, like being partially on a piece of wood, can slow heat loss but rarely solve it. What you see is a progressive functional decline. Movements get smaller and less coordinated. The usable window is measured in minutes, not tens of minutes. Once the ship is no longer a nearby visual reference, the scene becomes a dispersed field, separated boats, debris, and people scattered in the dark. Distance perception changes because light carries poorly and sound gets lost to wind and water. For those in the water, the limit becomes how long posture and breathing can be maintained before hypothermia and respiratory exhaustion. For those in boats, the focus is keeping buoyancy, avoiding collisions with debris, and managing basic resources. The calm sea remains deceptive. It reduces waves, not heat transfer. The statistical outcome is shaped more by the clock than by any single action. As the debris field spreads, visual searching becomes a sweep, limited by lantern range and boat stability. Even when there's intent to find people, execution is constrained by capsize risk, cold, and low visibility. In the water, the typical progression is reduced movement until passive floating, consistent with coordination loss and falling core temperature. The night environment prevents quick confirmation of what's happening just yards away. That's why the centerpiece here isn't the moment of sinking, but the interval right after. The Titanic disappeared in hours. The cold keeps deciding the outcome in minutes. After the sinking, the scene is defined by three limits: darkness, distance, and temperature. In near freezing water, coordination fails quickly, reducing the ability to grip, swim, or keep the head stable above the surface. In lifeboats, priorities shift to stability, avoiding debris, and conserving light and energy. Calm seas reduce noise and foam, but not heat transfer. The result is a very short rescue window for anyone in the water. In that interval, minutes matter more than any other variable. In the dark, searching depends on lanterns and basic signals, but the practical range is limited by low haze and the horizon itself. Even when boats are relatively close, distance perception can fail because there's almost no visual reference. For those in the water, the problem is physiological. Breathing and movement become less controllable, and hand dexterity disappears. For those in boats, approaching debris zones involves collision risk and instability. In practice, the operational decision becomes a trade-off between boat safety and the chance of recovery. The result is an unavoidable delay between spotting and making effective contact. When the rescue ship approaches, the procedure shifts to embarkation logistics. Identify boats, keep separation from the hull, and transfer people safely. In calm seas, the approach is more controllable, but rope ladders and lines still require strength and coordination many no longer have after cold exposure. So the crew uses ropes, tackles, and hands-on support to stabilize the boat and reduce falls. Dawn light improves orientation and counting, but it doesn't recover the time lost in the water. Effective rescue here is a technical sequence of simple steps repeated under cold and fatigue. The difference between arriving and successfully boarding is still measured in minutes. On the rescue ship's deck, the priority is reducing heat loss, shelter from the wind, dry blankets, and gradual rewarming. The initial assessment is clinical and practical, without modern instruments. Observe shivering, stiffness, level of consciousness, and peripheral circulation. Hot drinks help, but wind protection and changing out of wet clothing are often even more important. The process demands space management because cold keeps acting even out of the water. From this point on, survival stops depending on the sea and starts depending on triage and rewarming. The environment changes, but the thermal factor remains central. As boats are collected, the operation enters counting and record keeping. How many arrived, how many are still missing, and how to organize resources on deck. The crew uses boat hooks, lines, and tackles to prevent the boat from striking the hull and to keep boarding safe. The procedure is repetitive by necessity. Approach, stabilize, transfer, record, then move to the next. Even with better visibility, open water still imposes distance and maneuver time. The final image of this phase is operational, one ship gathering boats and people, while the sinking site becomes nothing but coordinates on a chart. From here on, the story becomes documentation. When you analyze the event, cold emerges as the dominant variable because it acts directly on the limits of the human body. It's not just low temperature, it's the combination of very cold water, wind, and soaked clothing accelerating heat loss. Simple instruments and log entries help turn that into numbers: cold air, near freezing seawater, and prolonged exposure. The key point is that the sinking took hours, but functional incapacity in the water can arrive within minutes. That difference in timescale explains why many weren't defeated by the sinking, but by the environment. Calm seas weren't a cushion. They were a silent stage for a fast physiological process. Underestimating the cold also ties back to protocols and knowledge of the era. There was little standardization for emergencies in extremely cold water. Flotation devices existed, but they didn't provide thermal insulation or preserve motor coordination. What changes afterward is how safety is conceived: lifeboat capacity, training, sweep procedures, and preparation for extreme conditions. Visually, this shows up in inventory and organization. Rescue isn't only about launching boats. It's about keeping people alive until pickup. Practically, the event exposes a human limit that discipline can't negotiate. Cold sets the deadline. When you reconstruct the sequence, the causal chain is clear: lateral contact with ice, water entering multiple areas, gradual loss of buoyancy, and an evacuation limited by capacity and time. Then the dominant variable shifts to ice-cold water and darkness, which strip coordination and consciousness quickly. Period documentation tries to translate that into maps, diagrams, and reports, because that's how an event becomes an operational lesson. The goal isn't to dramatize, it's to explain why, in a polar environment, being off the ship can still be a lethal condition. What decides it is the interval until effective thermal shelter, and that interval, that night, was longer than the body can tolerate. In the technical closing, the conclusion is straightforward. Most deaths didn't depend on an immediate impact, but on the environment after the sinking. In water near 28-degree fires, the window for useful motor and breathing function closes fast, even with partial flotation. Rescue arrived, but the body's physiological clock had already advanced before that. That's why Titanic sank in hours, while the cold acted in minutes. That difference supports the title. The thermal factor condemned more than the sinking process itself. The calm ocean in the end wasn't relief. It was only the surface of a physical limit.
This video was an AI reconstruction inspired by records from the era, created to tell a story with cinematic language.